And now I'd like to welcome Ray Savage, who is working on something called the Reset. So welcome, Ray.
Good evening, Clive. Thanks indeed for that. And yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the New Humanity Movement conference. I think that the timing of that conference is really perfect. It's bringing together a lot of people who are in our field, if you like, and going to catalyse a lot of movement. So I'm excited about that, and certainly book my ticket.
Well, excellent. So tell us about the Reset.
Okay, the Reset's really been born out of a group of constitutional researchers who've been looking at our constitution, a couple of them for over 10 years, and have found that we actually have almost enshrined within our ancient constitution our ability to reset it, and really a requirement that if things become so out of kilter as obviously they have now, that we indeed do that. And this group of experts and a wider group of us gathered just about a month ago, so this is very, very recent, to really have a bit of a brainstorm and come up with a way that we could actually bring this out to the greater sort of humanity, and particularly in this country, is because the Reset very much applies here. But I understand that it is a model that could actually go out. So it really runs a little bit like this. If we go back in time to certainly we can go back pre-Alfred the Great, but if we go back to Alfred the Great, our constitution was first sort of put down in his time, inspired by him after making a trip around the country. And he really enshrined the principles of cause no harm, cause no loss. I don't have the actual precise sort of wording of what came up at that time, but suffice to say that that was enshrined in our common law then. And again, in 1215, when Magna Carta was brought about at Runnymede, the Constitution was again re-enshrined and you could say reset. And the reset has occurred quite a number of times. Our experts tell us that it's around about 45 times through until 1600 and some odd, when there was the Bill of Rights. Basically, all of those happenings were really to enshrine the principles of fairness of our governance, which I'm sure everybody realizes now is very, very far from fair. What the constitutional aspect actually does is give us the right to revisit what is there in our history and bring it back into being in probably a more modern way. And there is a process for that. The process involves the parishes, and a lot of people actually aren't aware of the term parish, and some people think it relates to church. But certainly in all of our rural areas, the parish still exists. And generally, it'll be around a church area, but the parish has defined boundaries. And certainly in the parish that I live in, the parish of Alfriston, it encompasses a populace of about 800. And each parish has the ability to call a parish referenda if 10 people stand and actually say that that is what they require. And they only need to be resident in that parish, and they can bring about a gathering, and they can hold a referenda, and they can elect a member of the parish to go forward to a regional convention, which is apparently the constitutional name for this. And that regional convention can actually vote then to send members through to a national convention. So what you can do then is to have representation really from the ground up to a national gathering. Now, this can completely be aside any form of government interference. It's something for the people, by the people, of the people, and obviously starting from the ground up, it can represent the people's wishes.
So you're saying that we could, at a parish level, change the entire face of the nation, are you?
Absolutely, yeah. That is very much open to us. One of the things that we talked about with the reset was really looking at our taxation system as really a hook to get people interested in this. Most people are aware that our taxation system is currently skewed. It's skewed against the poor, it's skewed against the infirm, and recently even more so against the disabled. And I'll talk about that in a minute. There are some 300 or so taxes that the poor, the infirm, and the middle classes are hit with. And that taxation system in 2012, and these are government figures, raised somewhere in the region of $500 billion. It's just slightly under that figure. If that tax base was wiped out, in other words, all those taxes, those 300 odd taxes were wiped out, and just 1% as a levy was put on every commercial bank transfer, then that figure derived would actually jump to 1.5 trillion. I mean, you may ask yourself, where the heck has that trillion gone? Why indeed do we not have that now? Well, it's obvious that the trillion is the escaping of taxes by the major corporations that are really skinting us and are pretty much running this planet, who are not paying tax. So that 1%, which we're calling TEAL, total economic activity level, would actually flip the taxation so that there would be somewhere in the region of 200 million available to every constituency. That's just a sort of an easy division. And it would be possible to pay a living wage to every person of £7,500 over the age of 18. Now, would that not reinvigorate and free up the way we exist in this country? And that is just a small shift of taxation, which would immediately take out just so many people from the tax bracket and just put 1% on bank transfers, but just commercial bank transfers. And that would radically change everything and give us sort of a local autonomy, which currently we're not seeing. A very good example of the lack of local autonomy is in my particular parish. We've had a particular problem with a water main that's Victorian and that continuously is leaking, and we've tried to get our water company, who are earning I don't know how many billion every year, to replace this main, but they'd rather send people along every time it leaks, and it does that regularly, to replace the leaking section rather than replace the whole structure. So what we've got is locally a system where we aren't in control of what goes on locally, whereas with the reset we would actually be able to redress that and actually start putting money back into locality with the local say-so.
And how feasible do you believe it is that this reset could happen, and when could it happen?
Well, bearing in mind that we really have only put the idea together in the last 3 or so weeks, it's quite a large group of us have been pretty busy up and down the country, and we've been talking to many different groups about the idea and about the hook of the tax and about holding constitutional conventions, and we've barely met anybody that hasn't said, yes, that's what's needed. One group that we spoke to were a group of environmentalists at the London School of Economics that included two very well-known names. One's Polly Higgins, who's been trying to put forward the idea of bringing into being a law of ecocide, which should have actually been enshrined when the United Nations was set up, but was rejected by 4 countries, and no one's going to be surprised at this. The countries of the US, the UK, Netherlands and France, they refused to have ecocide on their books. But Polly was giving a talk along with some other very, very well-known environmentalists. And the talk that evening was capped off by Michael Meacher MP. Now, Michael's been a parliamentarian for 40 years non-stop. He's certainly in my book, one of the more respectable MPs, and he was for a period the environment minister for this country until he actually stood up against genetic modification, the GM foods, and he lost his job as environment minister because he wasn't cow-taking basically to the corporate cartel. And when he was talking, he said the only thing that is change the deadlock, and Polly said the same, the deadlock of what we have here with basically almost a despotic rule by the corporations over our normal parliamentarians, or not I say normal parliamentarians, certainly the cabinet type parliamentarians, would be a social movement from the grassroots. And we shared, as a small group of us were there representing the reset, we shared the idea of the reset, and they said, well, just bring it on. Because in Michael's words, Parliament now is unaccountable. You've got a clique that run Parliament that totally ignore the will of Parliament, and I couldn't believe when he actually shared that evening that they'd recently had a vote in the House, 120, I think it was 5-2, about asking for an inquiry into a bill that was being announced that was going to severely restrict money paid to disabled people. And the minister, when he had this put to him, just more or less ignored it. And this is what we've got going on all the time. And I know many of the shows that have been on the UK column are really talking about the institutional denial that we have with just so many aspects of our top-down hierarchical sort of control that takes place. So to answer your question, everybody we've seemed to have talked to almost without fail, there's obviously reservations, but almost without fail say, if we can get behind something called the reset and we can bring this about from a grassroots movement, then yes, absolutely, we're up for it.
It sounds a little bit like the idea that was being put around 2 or 3 years ago of the Robin Hood tax. Is it a little bit like that?
I'm not too familiar, actually, Clive, with regard to the Robin Hood tax. But I think the timing of the reset is really just so perfect. There seems to be such an impasse on every level. I know you particularly are concerned with health. And, I keep hearing of many, many good people trying to bring integrative health into our mainstream and being knocked back generally by personality and character assassinations of really, really good people who want to try and get homeopathy and acupuncture and essential oils and the sort of work that you do with diet and those sorts of things brought into the mainstream, but are knocked back because of this huge pharmaceutical corporate lobby that we have that is absolutely running amok. And there's almost no one that you speak to now that is not aware of that. So, yeah, if a Robin Hood tax is basically taking the tax burden away from the individual, and certainly the poorer individuals, and it's definitely the poorer that it hits, and putting it fairly and squarely on the corporate profit makers, then gosh, I'm absolutely for it. And if they want to call it Robin Hood, yeah, why not? I quite fancy the idea of being a bit of a Robin Hood, actually.
Well, quite. I mean, certainly, as far as, let's say, the NHS is concerned, if they put a fraction of the money into prevention, nutrition and basic supplementation when necessary, I would have thought you'd be able to empty 90% of the hospital wards in a year or less.
Yes, I totally go with that. Everything has got so ridiculously skewed. We've got a system that really is looking at placing band-aids over rather than looking at what the causes are. And I'd 100% go with that. And I think I was sharing with you before we came on air just how a bit of prevention can actually completely alter a person's life.
Well, quite. So what do people do to get involved and make sure that it actually happens?
Well, the Reset have a website that's only been live for 3 days now, and it's called, the 3 W's, The Reset, all in lowercase, all joined up, .org, so it's thereset.org. If you go onto that site, the site has a little piece on the mission, has quite a nice little DVD section, and then as you scroll down it, you'll find a few aims and objectives, a place where you can contact us. If you log in your name, your email address, you'll find it'll come up with which parish and which ward you're in, and if you want to put something in the inquiry form and whether you are actually happy to volunteer to host a meeting or perhaps become an ambassador, then that information is available for you to place on the website. And even more important is actually to share it. So log in yourself and then share. And there's some share buttons on there through Facebook, Twitter, and all of the aspects. And really just share this idea. And really recapping, what we're looking for is to make a world that's more just, that really focuses on people care, earth care, and fair share. And certainly the tax aspect is very much about sharing fairly.
Well, excellent. And so presumably if one put a 2% surcharge or whatever it's called on the corporate banking transactions, then we could each get £15,000 a year.
Yeah, well, if we had, apparently we could set a cap of a maximum of 2%, and we would be absolutely rolling in it, and the money we'd be able to put in infrastructurally to bring in some of the health the health sort of modalities that I know you definitely espouse would be incredible, and the way we could regenerate. I was very interesting. I was attended a conference in London. I've been doing quite a lot of conferences and gatherings, really just to share the message of reset, and as I said, such incredible reception everywhere that I've been. But I was doing a conference in London the other night, and it was very fascinating to listen to a PhD student talking about the studies that have been done worldwide, and I'd never actually heard this before, of places where they've given more than a basic living wage, where they've given a decent sum from the profit of those countries to each person, and far from what our hierarchical bunch would actually have us believe. Those people don't sit on their backsides. It actually encourages entrepreneurialism. It actually gets people going out, doing philanthropic work, and really doing what makes their hearts sing, instead of scraping around to make money from these just over broke jobs that the hamster wheel has trained us to sort of be focused on. And it revitalizes. And of course, it actually gives people the opportunity of really pursuing what their gifts are. But of course, the downside would be that the controllers would not have the control. And maybe we have to have a little bit of sympathy for them in realizing that those days are finished. And I feel very, very positive about the reset and what it can do, but it just needs populating. It needs people to get behind it and make it work. And I see it happening. I see there's such a groundswell of need for something new. And this is something new, something quite evolutionary, without being challenging to the old. It will just leave the old to fizzle away, as we all know it is pretty quickly now.
Well, quite. And that in conjunction with the Bradbury Pound, where we can change a debt-based economy to a value-based economy and start building things, I think we could see the end of poverty virtually immediately, and a return to proper values where things are made to last rather than made to break. It's extremely frustrating that everything these days is made to break. Therefore, we have to work 6 times harder because we've got to replace things 6 times that could have lasted all that time. I remember buying my first washing machine 30-odd years ago, and it was no better than the one that I have now. In fact, it was significantly better than the one I had now, actually, and would have been a beautiful design icon if it was still in my kitchen now, instead of needlessly breaking. So I think what you're doing is fabulous, and I hope that people will pick up on this, go to the reset.org website, and I think we should change the world as soon as possible. Have you got a date in mind for the reset?
Well, it just so happens that by May, June of next year, we're coming up for the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. And the 8 is a beautiful symbol to me. If you've laid the 8 on its side, it's just that beautiful homeostatic sort of flow of energy with that lovely 0 point in the middle. So what better date than actually to formulate and have laid out, and I believe there are celebrations already organized, than to have a grand new charter for the way we exist on this planet. And let's absolutely stamp it for May, June next year at Runnymede.
Right. Well, brilliant. So thank you very much, Ray, for coming on. That's very, very interesting, and I hope inspiring for everybody.